So real. Okay.
What's up, guys? I'm Austin.
Matt.
This is...
Wait, let's do that again.
Yeah, hold on.
Weird. I was like,
what are we called? What's up, guys? My name's Austin.
My name's Matt. All right. No, for real.
One more.
Well, let's like do a countdown with the hands.
What's up, guys? This is Austin.
My name's Matt.
And this is Clearly Overthinking. A little bit nerdy.
And a lot of it.
One more again.
This is going to be really easy.
This all makes sense in my head, and I think it makes sense coming out, but it might just be like a jumbled mess.
Let's get it.
All right.
Sweet.
So Matt and I have been stirred to do this topic today because a coworker of mine got me listening to a certain season of a podcast that is
Seen on radio.
Yeah, Seen on Radio, season 7, which is all about capitalism. And I am not necessarily anti-capitalist. And my coworker was, everything that this coworker would say is like, it's because of capitalism. It's because of capitalism. It's terrible. And I'm like, I'll at least give it a listen because I don't know enough to say like that opinion is silly. And so I was like, I'll listen to it. And then I was talking to Matt about it one day because there was a lot of stuff that they were unpacking. And Matt is quite philosophical in the political sphere. So,
well, I was starting to listen to it and I was telling Austin, I was like, dude, this is like a very Marxist interpretation of history of capitalism. It's kind of like a creative retelling of a lot of his work.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought we would talk about it on podcasts, not just like Seen on radio, because it'd be kind of hard to do that justice. It's like 12 or 11 episodes of like an hour a piece.
It's a lot.
I mean, there's so much there to go over, but we thought we would talk about Marxism and kind of critiques of capitalism. And I don't know what your thoughts are for like the purpose of the episode. What I was thinking is we would talk about it in a way where like I'm trying to, I'm not an expert at this, but I have spent a lot of time reading up on this stuff. And I feel like not just for us, like you, me, coworkers, I think in general in the culture, this word Marxism or Marxist is thrown around and it's like the super like pejorative term.
Oh, 100%.
It's like your boogeyman stuff. And I think what I would love for this episode to be is just more educational to help people understand like what exactly did Marx think and teach, and like why are we still talking about him? Why are his interpretations of capitalism still around? Mm-hmm. What are the most relevant parts of his thinking that maybe contributed to other things? And so that's kind of where my mind was at, is like trying to take a little bit more of like an educational approach to inform people a little bit more about the philosophical stuff.
I think that's good because like you said, I mean, we all have preconceived notions of what these terms mean, and they may or may not be fleshed out like at all. So capitalism good, Marxism bad, capitalism bad in recent times. Like in the US, we've certainly talked, or our culture has pushed a more like negative air around capitalism. And so let's start with this. Are you a Marxist?
I'm not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I would say, here's what I'd say is, and this is maybe one of the disclaimers. I'd have a few disclaimers. One is I'm not an expert, obviously. Two is that the way in which I'm going about teaching this is more the philosophical side, because I think the philosophy behind a lot of his critiques of capitalism are still around, and like they're the most enduring aspect of his work. Mm-hmm. And you see expressions of like his underlying logic and his view of history. You see that still alive and well in the form of like critical social theory, which most people know as like critical race theory. That's like a branch of critical social theory. In that way, I kind of want to teach like the principles more. And do it. Yeah. And so that's the second disclaimer. The last one is that I am assuming, and this will probably make more sense as I go on talking about this, but my interpretation of Marxism is that it is a worldview. And that is kind of a hot take, because that's language we use for things like religious context. Like, as Christians, we have a worldview, which is kind of just a way of saying like we have a totalizing understanding of the world in terms of, where it came from, where it's going. How do we interpret certain things in our world now? How do we understand the good, bad, the ugly,
Sure.
and what's the answer to that, and there's not really anything in a worldview. Well, not going to say anything, but there's very few things in a worldview that can't be explained by it. And in the sense of like your lived everyday experience, you're, going to work, someone cuts you off and you're like, man, why are people so rude? It's like, well, your worldview accounts for that. It has something that says, yeah, maybe it's not in like Leviticus, like don't cut your neighbor off when you're driving, you know what I mean? But the principle is there, and it says like, yeah, this dude's a fallen guy, and in a moment of, recklessness, they were thinking about themselves and cut you off, and
Sure.
we generally would attribute that to sin.
And you're saying that Marxism has the same amount of depth to it as like that sort of.
Yeah, I would say it has an alternative explanation for even stuff like that, which is why I think people like your coworker who maybe have been exposed to a lot of this thought, it's hard to not see, which is why I think for me, I would never say I'm a Marxist, but I know that my tendencies to view the economy in a more Marxist lens, it's hard to get out of my head just because of how much of this stuff I've read. But and maybe that'll make sense in a little while. But it's just one of those things where you either bought in to the ideology in a lot of ways, or you reject it outright.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't really leave room for like super middle ground. But again, I would say I can't be a Marxist on the fundamental basics of the what I would say worldview of Marx. So we can get into it. Does that make sense though?
Oh yeah, 100%. My only disclaimer is that I don't know anything about economics. And so I know capital means money.
Yeah.
And I know that
if you're
Marxism
a capitalist,
is sort of synonymous with communism.
Yeah.
So, and communism bad, right?
Yeah.
That's what I learned from the 1950s in history class.
Capitalism good, communism bad. Why say a lot word when a few words do trick?
So anyway, let's just jump right in.
Yeah. So one of the things I would say is like the power of Marxist thought is kind of like outside of any single person's control now. And so you can learn about it, but it's not like, I don't think there's very many people who would, there's different views on different like threads of Marxism and stuff. What I would say I know best is like classical Marxism. So it's kind of like the underpinnings of his original thought, where his thought came from, the thinkers he drew upon to develop his thought. Like I'm more familiar with that than the more modern expressions, which might have more to say about like a digital economy and all this other stuff. So, but I think the principles are still around. And I guess one thing that you can say, and Marx kind of writes this in the Communist Manifesto, but he basically says like all history is the history of class struggle.
Yeah.
And so if you were just like do an elevator pitch of Marxism, that's kind of what it is. That's a very kind of simplified understanding that I think a lot of people intuitively understand. So when you're on, the news and this person's like the working class this, the working class this, and then, right-wing news media is like, this guy's a Marxist. Like that's what they're talking about. They're talking about viewing a political issue or the history of a political issue or even the country in a state of class warfare where there's a class that has nothing and a class that has everything. The modern expression of this has been like the 99%, you know what I mean? Like they talk about in the scene on radio.
Yeah.
But historically, there's not really that much aggregation of wealth. But in Marx's time, it was pretty clear that you had people that owned the means of production, and you have people that they didn't own anything but their own labor. And so that's kind of what they sold, and they're the workers, right? So TLDR, Marxism is all of history is class struggle. And the classes are basically binary, where you have the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois, see, however you say it. That's the ruling class. That's the people with all this stuff. And then you have the proletariat, which are all the workers, the worker bees.
Yeah.
You could kind of end the podcast here and be like, all right, have a sufficient understanding for some of the concepts that you'll run into as you hear like political discourse, whatever. But I want to go about talking about Marxism in a way that explores the more worldview aspect of it. So starting with, I've got notes here. Hold on. Why is it important? Yeah, so kind of touched on this. It provides a way of viewing the world that explains capitalism's failures and shortcomings. I mean, that's kind of natural. Like it's still valuable because it still has some good critique there, at least philosophically, historically influential. I would say communism in particular, but Marxism in general, has been one of the most influential historical developments, especially for the modern world. And the ideas themselves are where the power comes from. Like a good example of this is the Russian Revolution. So Russia's the first communist country. It's World War I. Germany's fighting Russia. Not going great. So Germany's like, how do we get out of this? How do we try to like nullify this front? This is too much to deal with. They know this dude Vladimir Lenin was exiled / kind of left Russia so he wouldn't get killed for his radical Marxist views. He's been camping out across Europe. Well, Germany gets a hold of him and they're like, bro, we'll send you back to Russia and we'll give you some money and we'll send you with a couple friends, and your only goal will be to like cause chaos. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So that's basically what he does. In the middle of World War I, Germany sends Vladimir Lenin over some buddies and some backing, and he sparks the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
And they institute the first communist government. And so the ideas are really powerful. That, Leninism / Stalinism stuff, like that's its own thing. The Cold War into World War II, or World War II into Cold War. You have all of these elements that it's one of the ideas that drives a lot of this. And it might not be just this idea in isolation, but because capitalism kind of become the air we breathe, the introduction of like an antagonistic idea, like that fight kind of drives a lot of historical developments, which is ironically what we'll talk about later, or maybe coincidentally. But any other questions before I move on to the next section?
No, I don't think so. I mean, how much time was there between, or were their lives happening at the same time between like Marx and Lenin? Like, is there an affiliation between the two, or is it just
not really? Not that I know of. I mean, they could have. There could be some like extended history I'm not aware of, but I think Lenin's doing his thing more around the time of the First World War, his early 1900s, and then Marx dies. I want to say like, I don't know, 1860.
Oh, really?
Maybe? Something along that. I could be a little bit off there.
No. I don't. That's surprising. I just don't.
Yeah, and his
didn't
buddy,
realize it was that far back.
So I showed you that reader I have. It's called the Marx Engels reader. Marx Engels is kind of like the academic, like hyphenated, the proper way of attributing a lot of his work, because while Marx wrote a lot of stuff, he was financially backed by his rich buddy, Friedrich Engels. And when Marx died, he edited and published his later, I think the second half of Volume, which is like his super big work, or second half of Capital. I'm sorry. The second volume of Capital is what he helped publish, but they worked together on stuff. So it's not entirely clear in every case where Marx's thought stops and where Engels starts.
Gotcha.
So they kind of loop them in together. But so whether or not Engels had some sort of crossover with Lenin or not, I have no idea.
Okay.
But there could be something.
Just curious.
Yeah. So Marxism, what do you need to know to understand Marxism in greater depth? I think the first thing you have to understand is that Marx is a materialist, a philosophical materialist. So a lot of the things he's going to argue about are not going to make sense if you don't understand this fundamental point. And in philosophy, materialism isn't like the accumulation of goods or the preoccupation with like having material things. It's more so like a position of analyzing the world. So materialism would suggest that there is no like spiritual reality, that the fundamental aspect of the world, like reality in the world, its essence is physical or material. And so it's not that you can't have abstract things, like consciousness or whatever, but that all of those things find their existence really in the material world.
Okay.
A physical interaction of some way. This is like maybe a good way to think about it is considering the opposite. So in philosophy, if you're not on if like you had a spectrum, materialism's on one side The other side is idealism.
Mm-hmm.
And idealism is kind of the opposite, where, you might be familiar with Descartes. He said, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
It's kind of that idea, maybe like a poor rendition of it. In modern language would be like perception is reality. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It's this idea that like the world as you know it and the realist aspect of the world exists primarily in the mind or in consciousness.
Okay.
So it doesn't really have.
And this is idealism.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this would be like you're rooting everything in existence basically to your ability to perceive or understand it. So that's on the polar opposite of Marx. Marx is like everything is material. His materialism expresses itself on like everything he writes basically. But that's why I get so worked up about capitalism, because for him, the way that we relate to each other in like a physical sense is really important. The way that we relate to the physical world is really important. And under capitalism, he thinks that like it's completely jacked, So,
okay. So so what is his ideal interaction, or like ideal definition of like what this interaction ought to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we can talk about his views of human nature, which is it's not really fully developed, honestly.
Okay.
His view is basically that people are producing things, that they have this innate desire to create things, and especially in the absence of any need, like they're just productive people. Like people are just primarily productive, and the free exercise of interacting with your physical world and creating something out of it and having that thing kind of like look back at you and reaffirm your creativity. Like this kind of philosophical approach is really what he sees the kind of fullest expression of humanity to look like. So essentially, if none of us are like in need, or if our needs are being met, we are driven to be productive,
creative, or like produce ingenuity. Yeah.
And I'd say it's even more so that he just thinks of it as like freely creating. So it's like you would produce, if like, say you needed food and you go hunt, you make a fire, do all that stuff. But even in the absence of that, you're like, maybe carving a wood knife, or you're drawing a picture or something. Like this idea that you must create something, or you interact with your world in a way that produces something. And the fact that you do that of your own volition, that's like what he would say is like the most human thing about you.
Okay.
That kind of ties into what does he think the ideal is? I think he just thinks the ideal is free productive force. Like he wants people to be free to be themselves. And that kind of looks like being able to work on their own terms, being able to work on something that they want, to creatively pursue their passions. And
is there a greater purpose like for humanity behind that, or like freely pursue these, avenues of production for like a greater purpose, or just for like the enjoyment of the individual?
It's probably more the second one, although I don't know of any writings where he's like explicitly turning it to like a psychological element.
I don't mean to like misrepresent necessarily. I'm just curious because I don't know, like if there's an idea that like if this is a more ideal society, how does it, I don't want to say perpetuate growth, because that's kind of like a capitalist thing to say, but like how does it perpetuate the human species, or like does that even matter in Marxism?
It's hard to say for me, because I don't know.
Okay.
But what I'd say based on what I do know is that he has this idea that a stateless, propertyless society with no money, it's literally kind of just like a tribal existence where there's more freedom.
Sure.
And that way he has a little bit of like a Rousseau vibe, where Rousseau thinks of civilization and thinks of it as like this corrupting force. You could probably use capitalism as like a substitute for that. And that's kind of Marx, where he's like, we had a time where we kind of had things in common. And then after that, everyone decided they want to like enslave each other. And then you have feudalism. And then, so I don't know, it's not entirely clear in my mind exactly what he would say, but it's probably something along the lines of just like a free society, and what that looks like. But I don't think we've ever seen, which is kind of why, spoiler alert, cutting to like part of why it's still around is that like if you really understand what Marx is talking about, and then you look at the implementation of his views in the form of communism, you're like, this is completely different, which is why it keeps coming up. You know what I mean? People are like, hey, we tried that, didn't work. Well, the typical retort's going to be, yeah, but that's not what
communism,
he taught.
like true communism has never been tried.
Well, it's because it's almost impossible. It's utopian. It's like
well, that's the same thing they say about like this may be like going down a different rabbit trail, but that's the argument that a lot of people will use for socialism too, when it's like, well, we know these socialist countries aren't doing well, and they're like, well, that's not true socialism.
Yeah.
So what's the piece that's missing that makes it not true?
I mean,
you know what I mean? And I don't want to like necessarily run down socialism if it departs too extremely from communism.
It does, but only because socialism has like a longer history than Marx.
Okay.
But it takes off with Marx because he's one of the first dudes to really apply like a materialist vision of what's wrong, and that emphasizes the conditions as we know them. So rather than like, and he talks about this too, rather than push the idea into the past that says like, at some point in the past we got things wrong, or rather than push the idea too far into the future and say we're waiting for like the redemption of the world, say for Christians, he's more of like, hey, he'll say this a bunch of times in his work, like we proceed from an economic fact. And what he means is we proceed from a material reality, like as things are, this is the way that things are. And then he'll go on and yada, yada. But so he's much more concerned with, in his writings, the things as he understands them in that moment. And the only reason he spends a lot of time in history is to kind of show that there are underlying forces within capitalism that are pushing the history in a direction.
Okay.
So we can get into that a little bit more, but philosophical materialism, human nature as productive. And then I guess, we can go into the history part of it. Marx had a view of history that's linear, which is to say it is progressing towards something. And that something for him is communism. And he saw capitalism as a step towards that. So in his mind, capitalism would inevitably fail, and in its failure would produce socialism. And in socialism's lack of the free ideal would inevitably go into like a communist state.
Okay.
Or like, and I say state, but that's really just communism. It's probably the best way to understand it. But that's because Marx has an idea of history that he kind of adapted from this guy he took a lot of his ideas from. And this is going to get a little philosophical, even more philosophical, but it's actually really important because this idea still permeates our culture, and it's actually what's pushing a lot of critical social theory. But he had this dude he learned from Hegel. He was part of a group called the Young Hegelians. Hegel was like a really on the opposite spectrum of Marx. He's an idealist, really hard to understand and read. People still debate what he meant, but he had this idea, which people have come to call a dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, where he called it like a master-slave dialectic, but regardless, is this idea that history is pushed along by kind of like a conversation or a back and forth between separate ideas. Well, for Hegel, it's separate ideas. For Marx, that looks like separate classes. But what he says is like, in any, quote unquote, epoch or era of history, there's an idea, which is kind of like the status quo. And within that idea, you have kind of like an anti-culture, or like an like he calls one the thesis. Then they have the antithesis or the antithesis. And those two things are at war with each other. And they bring about a new thesis, but for a time it's called the synthesis. So basically, if you would draft it or write it out on like a board or something, you'd have two kind of equal and opposite forces that clash, and out of that comes something new. But that new thing still contains in it some self-negating aspect of itself, something that is still needing to be resolved, and that creates another tension in which like a binary is created, and then those forces come together and it creates another and another and another. And so Hegel's great contribution to philosophy is that idea, is that in many ways all of society is pushed by these opposing forces that are constantly colliding and kind of reconstituting. And Marx didn't like idealism, and he also was anti-religious because of his materialist views, whereas Hegel seemed to be kind of like weird, like kind of Christian. I mean, it's debated. Prussia at the time was kind of like a state religion vibe. So it wasn't like there was a lot of options, but that's just to say that he didn't like those elements of Hegel. And so he kind of reverted them or inverted them and said, okay, well, if I look at history, it seems to be the case that there are always these opposing forces that are fighting and are driving history into a new version of what was before. And so that's when he gets into stuff about like feudalism and feudalism going into like a late feudalism was what I think they called it on CNN radio, or like early capitalism, where it's like mercantilism, but these different ways of relating to our productive life, the way that we produce things. And he sees that dissonance kind of resolving for a time, then producing something else, and then resolving for a time, then producing something else, until you get to capitalism. And just like in the regular kind of Hegelian dialectic, capitalism contains within it some self-negating aspects, some aspects which we would just say are not sustainable, but Marx would say are like that's the antithesis, right? The thesis and the antithesis are squaring off. Like,
can you define those things in the realm of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some really like broad sweeps that Marx would want to make, but I think we can see like some really easily identifiable microcosms. So, for instance, the Scene on Radio is a show, and it's derailing capitalism, or it's just basically, spending 12, 13 hours of time telling you how capitalism's the worst. But everything that they're doing in terms of flying across the world, recording things on technology, producing a show. Yeah. It's all the product of what capitalism has brought the country and what capitalism has encouraged in terms of technological development.
I have to admit that as I was listening to it, I'm like, this is very funny. Yeah. Like it's very, not to dog on them, but like, as I'm listening to it, I'm like, it seems a little hypocritical to take the stance that like capitalism is bad and we should be moving towards something else, when you consider that like, what are you guys doing with your profits? Yeah. Well, and you could look at one example that I always think is hilarious is that every episode starts with an ad for Progressive auto insurance. And it's like, bro, like that's literally what we're talking about. Is that like, it's part of how capitalism has, according to Marxists, stayed alive for so long, is because it takes everything and it absorbs everything into a money-making model where even being angry and anti-capitalist is a brand. Like it's somehow producing this thing which tries to work against it, but it's still much a part of capitalism. So that's kind of one example. And you see kind of little examples like that all over the place. But I think a more broad idea for Marx is that and because he's writing at a different time. So he's writing in like Industrial Revolution. He's seeing the beginnings of it in America as we're, fighting civil wars and fighting over slavery and stuff. And so he's got some really interesting views about that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think what he's wanting to say is, looking out at his world, he sees these terrible relations of textile mills and coal factories in towns. Like England had a really bad, you've seen Peaky Blinders. Yeah. That's a great example. Those like kind of slums or like the tenement housing where like they're literally just back to back to back to back. Like he looks at that and he's like, this isn't living, bro. This is terrible. And it seems that there's a lot of money being made, but it's not by the people working at these factories. And so he's got a different context. And in his context, the kind of embedded kind of dissonant element of capitalism that's creating that antithesis is the working conditions of the working class. And so capitalism needs workers for some reason, which he has a lot of ideas about. It tends to create this wealth gap disparity. And so that the conditions of the workers are so bad that they have no other response but to revolt. And that's a lot of what if you read the Communist Manifesto, that's like Marx is basically trying to describe that aspect of history about how wealth got aggregated and workers got more and more poor. And you have this weird relationship where capitalism is both defined by a working class, which it can use, but it is also forcing them into a position where they will overthrow it. And so for him, that's kind of this materialistic conception of history is what feel like people, I don't think he ever used that term, but people have called it the materialistic dialectic or historical dialectical materialism. So historical
referencing obviously that the progression of history, dialectical being a reference to the method, which is what he's getting from Hegel, and then materialism being the really big kind of his brand, like his stamp on that idea is the inversion of it to be materialistic. So you'll see that all over his writings. It's like one of his kind of big, huge, kind of prevailing thoughts. And that's also why he sees history as linear, where it's constantly going through iterations. Like our relationship to the world is constantly going through iterations, and it'll eventually get to a point where capitalism kind of eats itself, and then a new system will develop, and that'll keep happening until we get to this communist stateless society where we kind of have this more self-actualized existence, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That is a lot.
What you got?
So you mentioned something. So in a society where there's not capitalism, or like pre-capitalism, post-capitalism, whatever, like how is communism different than like just tribalism?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I have enough knowledge to really answer that. He has a really stark difference. Other than that, like communism would be like the end of the road, where tribal society was kind of the beginning. So
yeah,
it's almost like a return to a previous state, but I think the significance of it is much greater in his thought, because just like Hegel, it was like all of history is working towards this emancipation. Is kind of another word you'll hear a lot as you read Marxist thought.
So, but what is I'm still kind of like just lost on like, what is the meaning behind, or what is the purpose of the emancipation? You know, like why does it just end? Like, do you know what I mean? It's like we reach communism and then we produce, but we don't necessarily produce what's necessary, and then we all die.
Yeah, I don't know. There might be some other Marxists that have like tried to fill the gap there, but I don't have any good response. So like, say you get to a communist society as Marx describes it, what's next? Like, I don't think there is that I know of. I don't know if there's any real.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, it's something that I think you find with Marxism because of its understanding of history, but because of that Hegelian aspect of trying to make sure that there's always something fighting and resolving that's driving history. It's because of that, I think it's hard to imagine a time without it. True to form, I'd say, for Marxism and its friends is that there's really good, or convincing, I should say, there's really convincing arguments that are critiquing the failures of capitalism, but the solutions are maybe not all that great.
Okay.
I mean,
is that something you've got coming up, or is that something we can take some time to flesh out right now?
We could talk more about it. I mean, there's not much I had planned to say about that, except for that, like, you and everyone else listening probably knows how things have gone down. You know, like, historically, communism has not done the great things that Marx kind of envisioned. Certainly not in Russia in its Stalin era, even in China, the People's Republic. Like, there's just all these moments of transition where, like, rather than people being more free, they actually become more ruled or more enslaved in a sense. And that was kind of the opposite of what Marx had envisioned. And so I can't really tell you for sure. Like,
yeah, I mean, what are your notions of the failures of capitalism, just so we can sort of get that out on the table? Like, obviously he must have seen, like, he wasn't just generally saying like, my prediction is that capitalism will fail. I'm sure he fleshed out like, this is what the problems are with capitalism that will lead to its downfall.
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and I probably should have covered it by now. But when we talk about like some of the inner kind of dissonances of capitalism that are driving it, but also potentially going to be its downfall, is like, according to Marx, capitalism by its very nature is exploitative. And so when we think about capital, we think about, you can think about a couple different things. You can think about, a number sitting in a bank, but for Marx in his time, he's thinking about real property, real resources, owners that own these factories and have companies that span continents. So it's more of like capital represents the kind of aggregation of wealth or power into a few different hands, and it represents those people using that to produce more excess, I guess, is another way of thinking. Because capital really is, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about capital, that's really excess. And that's what the scene on radio wants to make it a point of, is that it's really only possible with colonialization, with like the taking over of foreign markets and kind of forcing them to give them over all their natural resources, and that produces this excess in the home countries, and then they produce industries based on those to either consume or adapt them. So I guess that's one thing, is that, capitalism, if you even just think about capital, for Marx, it is the result of exploitation. It is the result of necessarily taking advantage of someone.
Okay.
And he would say that, like, if we took the context again, like factory worker and factory owner owns all the things, dictates all the terms. There's no rights to labor or anything like that. And he makes money by having the worker produce more than he's paying the worker, because that's just how it is, right? Like, that's literally how the margin is created, is the cost of creating the thing has to be less than what you sell it for, or you don't make money. And I think Marx would say that, one, capitalism pushes the downward pressure on the worker, not on the owner. So it pushes pressure on the worker to produce more at less wages to create more capital, rather than it puts pressure on, say, an owner to be like, man, I should chill on all this ownership, or like I should chill on all this excess. Like I'm happy with what I have. You know what I mean? Like, that's not where the pressure is. The pressure, and we would generally call this the efficiency part. You know what I mean? Like, we would say, like, capitalism is great at efficiency, and Scene on Radio talks about it's great at competition. But what we're describing is this pressure that the market puts on individuals to constantly make more money than what they're getting paid. Like, make more money for their employers than what they're actually getting paid. And that relationship's clearer in an industrial economy, but it's not as clear, I would say, in this modern digital economy. So that's where, like, more neo-Marxist thought comes in, and I haven't read much of that. So
gotcha.
And so I don't know. That's one thing, I guess. What have we talked about so far?
Well, we were just talking about, like, the failures of, like, what are the failures of capitalism that Marx, like, would have lined out to suggest why communism, or how communism would sort of make up for the failures of capitalism.
Well, so that's the exploitation thing. He talks about how private property is basically a
theft.
Basically. I guess one way to think about it, this is maybe a core idea that's helpful for understanding some critical social theory. But one of the things that Marx liked to talk about, or liked to describe, was the nature of how everything ends up either coming under the control of capitalism or supporting capitalism. And so there's a few passages, I want to say, maybe in Capital, or in, like, I don't know, The German Ideology is another one he wrote, where Marx describes what he calls the base and the superstructure, or what people now call the superstructure. But the base would be, for Marx as a materialist, our relationship to the world.
Okay.
That's the economic conditions for him. That's, in this case, capitalism. That's the prevailing way that people relate to their productive work.
Yeah.
And so that's the base. That's the driving force of all history. That's the enslaving or emancipating part of humanity, is your ability to work freely, and that's not happening. So that's the base. And then he would look at things that come out of that, and maybe this is part of his radical view. He also drew on some legal guys who were debating the nature of and origin of property, but he looks at that and he says, well, the state exists not as a reflection of the people, but as a reflection of the market. It exists for capitalism, and it exists to encourage, protect it, to kind of reinforce the capitalist ethos and morality. That's how he sees the state working. That's also how he sees religion working. So, Marx being a notorious anti-religious dude, He calls religion the sigh of the oppressed people because he sees it as like a natural way in which capitalism creates for itself a justification as to why conditions are the way they are. And so he says, yeah, that's where this, you know, especially in Prussia and other places in Europe, where it's like this Christian ideology that, like, you know, you have some heaven to look forward to. And even to a certain extent, you could maybe argue that Calvinist interpretation Max Weber popularized, but they talked about it in Scene on Radio, where it's like, well, because you don't know if you're elect or not, you're constantly trying to work your hardest regardless of what the conditions are. And so, but for Marx, all of that is just, it's all derivative. It's all derived from a really bad relation to the material world. And so because you relate poorly to it, there has to be something that helps offset this terrible experience of living in a capitalist world.
Gotcha.
And so that superstructure element he thought would change if you could change class consciousness. If you could change the base, which is the fundamental driving force of everything he believes, the material conditions, if you can change the economics, change the capitalist system, everything would change. But you have on top of it all these things that are reinforcing capitalism, and in particular the state is probably the strongest element of that. So he's over here looking at it and he's like, well, you have all these workers that are being exploited and they don't gather together and they don't, you know, assert their rights and kind of overthrow capitalism because of the state. And so what they have to do is they must overthrow the state. And in order to actually realign the market conditions, like the actual material relations, to kind of get to that next level of history where we're closer to freedom. And that's why he advocated for like violent overthrowing of states. You know what I mean? It's like he thought that this, I guess I've already said class consciousness, but that's the way to think about it. Like there is a false consciousness that exists in the worker and the state of capitalism, where they either feel helpless, alienated, they hate their jobs, their lives, they hate other people, they can't really truly relate to the world, and so they're alienated from the world. Like he describes all these things that an experience in an industrial economy would actually, like, it would make perfect sense. You know what I mean? You're working 16-hour days, just like packing flour. Like your life is not legit. You know what I mean? So really resonated with people. But he was saying like this false consciousness exists where they refuse to band together, and they do that because of the morality being put forward by the state and the ruling class, and the religious kind of backing that tells people to basically just wait for a future time that your oppression will be answered, your justice will be given to you. And so that's kind of a big thing for him. He wants people to have that self-actualizing class consciousness where they realize, hey, we're all in this together and we are alienated from this stuff, and capitalism is the problem, and we do need to overthrow, you know. So it doesn't seem like he doesn't have much faith in that happening outside of, at least it seems like, outside of like a actual rebellion and actual overthrow of the government, and the adoption of class consciousness, like pushing people to understand that this is who they really are.
Yeah. So in that regard, has there not ever been the adoption of at least nominal communism without the violent overthrowing? Like if we think about Russia, China, Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's hard because I don't know if there has been, but I also think that communism took on a really kind of distinct expression where it became very authoritarian. So rather than like taking over the state to make sure that the redistribution of wealth and the abolition of private property happened, and the abolition of wage labor, like all those pie in the sky things Marx wants to do, that's kind of the idea I think he had in mind for taking over. But on almost every instance, a ruling party gets in power, and maybe a couple things change, but then power aggregates again. And then,
but is that not to like make sure that is this may be, I don't know, just an uneducated thing to say, but like, how can you ensure that things stay equal if there's not something to enforce the equality? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so in the way, I mean, maybe this is why you're saying it's like true Marxism or true communism is like utopian, because injustices are going to happen even in a like communist, because of the imperfection of humanity. Like inequalities or injustices are going to happen, and then that's going to set people at odds. And so someone is going to have some amount of power or authority or rule over the other person because I stole your cow. So now I have 14 cows and you have 12 cows.
Yeah.
Or
I know it, but it's so hard for us to contemplate and like understand, because he's not proceeding from like, at least he's deliberately rejecting things like the Christian worldview, where there's like so much human agency that you are, sinful person.
So how do you define right and wrong in those regards then? To even be able to say, like, to be able to even define something as injustice?
I think that's actually a huge issue with Marxist thought. And that's why I would say it's both a worldview, but also it's something that I reject as a Christian, because I think it fails in multiple ways in that way. Like, morality is freedom. It's free productive expression. But why should I care? Why should that be good for me? Why shouldn't I just do X, Y, and Z? And yeah, maybe capitalism might be bad, but maybe there's some other conceived way of, relating to the world that could be just as free as utopian society that involves the state. Like, could you redefine things? But I think the way that his worldview works, the way that Marxist thought ends up being like a worldview, is it just doesn't address that question as a
of like
one.
What is moral?
Well,
because my question is, maybe, I don't know if I'm like communicating it well, but like essentially, like if you have this violent overthrow and then we fall into this utopian communism, like, what is there to ensure that? I mean, I would imagine that he would, like, at least in some regard, he might not call it goodness, but maybe peace, or I don't know what he would call it. But what's there to ensure that that is lasting and there's not someone else that will come up and like disrupt the utopia? Yeah. And so, and the reason I ask that is because, like, I could see how, if they're trying to go for like if countries are trying to set themselves up for like true communism, like you have to have that redistribution of wealth. You have to get rid of the idea of private property. You have to get rid of like labor for wages. But then who will ensure that new status quo is maintained? Yeah. And like, if you don't, I think generally speaking, and this is coming from my worldview as a Christian, like, because of the imperfection of man, one human is going to find a way to like deceive or take advantage of another human being for benefit. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, what is his definition of morality, or his thoughts around morality that would keep it that way, or like that would even push us to maintain that?
Yeah, I can't tell you for sure, but when he talks about morality, he generally talks about it in the context of a capitalist society. So in his view, part of the way that the ruling class stays in power is by disseminating their morality. So one modern equivalent is like the idea of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. Like, he would argue that's a morality from a ruling class that says that kind of knows, kind of subconsciously, that that's not the reality. That wasn't the reality for them. That's not the reality for you. But it's a mentality that you have to have as a worker in order to make sense of the disparity in wealth. That it's actually on you. It's not the system. It's on you to make sure that you get wealthy and you achieve the life that you want. That type of idea, he would say, is kind of the morality that is embodied in the state, but it's also sent out through to the working class and people in general. And it's not entirely clear how all of that just magically flips. Like, one day everyone's thinking from a capitalist perspective and an exploitative perspective, and then all of a sudden everything's got everyone in common, and then everyone's happy.
Yeah, it seems like there would have to be like mass extinguishing of like basically all of humanity except for those who can't critically think, or like haven't been influenced by like the evils of capitalism, because if that's been something that you and I have been taught since we were children, like that's not going to go away.
Yeah, or
really, just like there's always going to be this sense of like, no, I'm like, as an individual, I'm responsible for like the the outcomes of my life.
But that's what I mean to say, though, is like when I talk about Marxism as taking a worldview type of perspective, that's kind of what I mean, is that like these are valid criticisms, but to like a true Marxist, they would look at that and be like, you only have this desire of morality because you live in a capitalist world that tells you you must have morality that looks like X, Y, and Z. That's wild. I know, but that's kind of, it's consistent within its own worldview to an extent. Those justifications may not be pervasive.
So that's why you can't really have an argument with that person, because it's like we literally have no common ground, like on which to build an argument against one another.
Well, think about it this way, and here's another example of how Marxism takes a worldview-like approach to things. And according to Marx, the oppressor and the oppressed are both enslaved. So obviously, in like maybe an expression of slavery, that's not true. Like, I'm a master, I've got slaves on my plantation, I'm not feeling very enslaved, right? But under his worldview, the system of capitalism enslaves everyone, and it warps everyone. So even that person who's in a position of power is actually a severely alienated person. It's a person that is living a life that is completely, maybe we should, I'm almost afraid to use this word, but inauthentic. Like it's a life that is not what was meant for people in general. So even though they might be comfortable, they might be having great, like, quote unquote, positive impact on the world. Maybe they're creating businesses of philanthropy, whatever. Marx would probably say that they're still needing liberation. Everyone needs to be freed from this relationship to the world. So although in its expression, some people look like they're doing really well and some people don't, everyone is under the same condition of needing liberation from a capitalist society. And so in a modern, or not a modern equivalent, but like an equivalent for Christian thought, that's sin. What we're talking about is sin, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you are Christian or not, you live in a place that's fallen, it's broken, right? And it needs salvation. And that's why I think it's more accurate to think of Marxism as a worldview, at least the people who are really Marxists, like really bought in, because it is like a totalizing view that tries to take everything and explain everything according to our messed up material conditions, So yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling, but
no, I mean, I think that was a good way to explain it. That's relatable, a lot more relatable. But yeah, that's just wild to me that it's like, essentially you're telling me that I have to totally deconstruct the thought processes that have been ingrained in me, like against my will, essentially. If I'm gonna like have the argument with a Marxist, like, well, what is even the point of that? Like, like, how do we know that the world is going to stay moral and that people aren't going to start taking advantage of each other? And then there's just like, no, well, don't even use the word moral. Because that's you wrong. Can see,
I mean, and then we have other philosophers that have come along, like Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche comes out and he basically says, like, he's not a Marxist per se, but he's very much a determinist, at least in a lot of ways. And he looks at the world and he's like, listen, like, stop acting like this morality is natural to us. Like, you guys are weak. You want to get rid of the religious kind of guardrails we've had for however last 1,000 years, and you want to keep all of the morality. He's like, it doesn't work. If God is dead and we've killed him, there is no morality. So stop acting like it. Stop imposing all these beliefs on people and just live your life to be the best person you can be, like to be whatever version of yourself you want, like express yourself fully, kind of is ultimately what comes out of his thought. And it's all of the world basically becomes, it's no longer about what is inherently good or bad, although we use that terminology because we struggle to find other ways of describing it. For Nietzsche and friends, and even probably neo-Marxists, it's not about good or bad, it's about power. It's about equality. So in a world where there is no morality, it's just a matter of who's the strongest, who's the most powerful. But
then that's not equal.
Exactly. So then a lot of the push for people that kind of adopt these beliefs is equality. And then as oppression becomes more abstract, so it becomes more psychological and becomes more about authenticity, now we're no longer talking about equality, we're talking about equity. And that means something completely different. And so these thoughts have a long history, but right around that time of Marx, this is kind of when you get these more intense views of materialism that are really taking off, because it turns out, a lot of people didn't really jive with their particular expression of Christianity in Europe, especially as they were struggling to understand how a loving God could let them kind of wallow in the pits of a coal mine.
Yeah.
And they're just experiencing injustice in a way that's like very, very tangible. It's not like a abstract, like, I feel like you don't, I mean, this is going to be kind of a jab, and I don't necessarily mean it, but I think it paints the picture well. But it's like, guys over there aren't like, hey, I don't like that you didn't use my pronouns. It's more of like, bro, I'm like the third person in my family to die of this black lung because I just live my lives in these coal mines. The other, like 3 months ago, 100 dudes get trapped in the mine, and that's just business.
Yeah.
That's their lives, and they have no recourse. And so for them, it's so much more tangible about like, what does oppression look like for them? And so in that world where you might say it's highly Christianized, but the way that they're living their world in the real life, in the physical and the material world, it seems like so different. And so along comes a guy and he's like, well, this is why, it's capitalism. And the reason why your religion doesn't explain it well is because it's designed to support capitalism. It's not actually real. And then people are like, what? So I think it was a kind of convergence of a lot of different pressures.
Yeah, it's just so interesting because what you're describing to me from my worldview sounds like, not like utopia. It sounds like chaos. But they won't call it chaos because the reason I'm calling it chaos is because I'm viewing it through the lens of like my morality.
Yeah. And I would also say that, like, admittedly, from my readings, which I haven't read everything, I've read a lot of Marx. I've read a good portion of Engels. I've read a good portion of Feuerbach. I've read a good portion of Hegel. I've read a little bit of Lenin stuff. These are like more of those people in that time period. And it doesn't seem like there is a really good, well-defined idea of what happens when all these things work. You know what I mean? Like, essentially their eschatology, their end times view is not very well defined. And I think that's because it's not necessary, in the sense that the driving force of Marxism is its critique of capitalism. It's not necessarily needing to give people a really well-defined vision of the future. It just needs to help people understand, like, you're enslaved and what you want is freedom. This is how you get it. You know what I mean? So,
but that hasn't just, I mean, practically speaking, that's just not how it's gone when people have done what he said you needed to do to get that freedom.
Yeah. And I don't know that there's a good playbook of, maybe there is, and I'm just not thinking of it, but I don't know. There's like a playbook of, communist revolutions that, like, hey, here's how you do it when you're doing it the right way. But it just seems like the history of communism is one of unfortunately, like a lot of authoritarian restructuring of society, where people kind of inadvertently consolidated power when as the opposite of what they wanted. We talked about a lot. We've talked about base and superstructure, talked about that, talked about consciousness.
Did we talk about class consciousness?
Yeah.
Commodification?
Oh yeah, dude, this is a big one. We kind of already talked about it, but it's like, it's the idea that, like, essentially everything in everything in a capitalist economy is viewed through the lens of capital and its ability to produce capital. So because of that, everything that can be bought and sold is bought and sold. And this is something they talked about on Seen on Radio, but it's even seen on radio as an object lesson, like this idea that you could brand anti-capitalist sentiment and sell it to people is something that exists. I mean, it's alive and well in our society, especially in America. Like, it's not something that we're unfamiliar with, but it's also something it's under the bounds of capitalism.
So you talked about, like, the state is essentially what props capitalism up in this, in Marxism. Is that accurate?
Basically, yeah.
So
like it exists.
The U.S. is America's version of capitalism unique in that those things can exist? Like, is it just because of the unique rules of the state in the U.S. that, like, you can have someone speaking out against the system without, like, destruction of that sect?
Well, I would say one, that it seems to be an empirical relationship between the state and the economy. So much so that in political science, they just call this political economy. So it's just this way of the state and the economy and how they relate to each other. One way you can also think about this, and this is one of the critiques of capitalism, when you talk to those people who are like the laissez-faire people, where they say like, hey, man, just let the market do its thing. Mm-hmm. It seems to be the case historically that the market has never really existed on its own, at least in the expression of capitalism. In every instance where capitalism was able to grow and do well, it was supported by the state, either in terms of subsidies or state-backed kind of aristocratic people, or it was done by rules which enforced what essentially were kind of one-sided deals that protected people who were risking their investments and not the people who were doing the work. So in general, that relationship between the state and the economy seems to be more or less objectively true. And that's why we argue over how regulated an economy should be. But I would say that's one thing. And I think the other thing too is that part of why Marx was so anti-capitalist is not because he thought it was, I don't know, antichrist, for lack of a better term, but more because its effects they like subsume everything. There's nothing that gets outside of it. It's just like a black hole. And I think you could say, if I were to try to give you a Marxist answer, what you were saying earlier, that the idea that you could have free speech and that you can have democratic elections or, a democratic republic or whatever you want. I think not knowing a lot of the neo-Marxist or modern interpretations of Marxism, I would probably just tell you that like that's just the evolution of capitalism. It's just creating a more efficient version of capitalism, which doesn't have to rule over you with an iron fist, but instead it affects the ideology that you have, where you think that you're free because you vote. You think that you're free because you can say whatever you want, when really what's dictating your elections are the billions of dollars being poured into the election system. I think that's probably what I would say.
So are we just in, I'm having a lot of thoughts right now, so I'm going to try my best to like articulate my questions. But so the US, there's no like limit to the reach of the US because we have commodified so much, like that episode in Seen on Radio where they're talking about like the cocoa farmers or the cacao farmers, and basically like how we have sort of taken advantage of them, and that like they make nothing, and like we take their cocoa and we use it for products that we sell in America. And so like, but the society, right, not the farmers aren't necessarily living in a country that is capitalist, but because we have impacted them, like the whole world is capitalist. So I guess my question is like, are we just in the late stages of capitalism where that is the case? Like when the US was really not the superpower of the world, was the world less capitalist?
I think people would say yes, in the sense that like it was less developed. Capitalism was less developed because there is such a thing as late stage capitalism. It is something that you see a lot in more like modern Marxist thought and critique.
So I guess another question that I've got is like US capitalism versus European capitalism. Is it just the same thing really in the grand scheme, because it's like it's global capitalism, or is there a distinction between like capitalism in Europe versus capitalism in the US? Or is it all working together?
I mean, again, I think we're in an area where I haven't read a lot of modern critique, but I would say that it's probably both.
Okay.
So it is both that America has a very distinct expression of capitalism, which makes it kind of uber capitalist, and the rest of the world has a slightly more regulated version of capitalism. But in general, this is part of the problem that I think you encounter with some of the proposed solutions, is that capitalism is now a global force. It's, neoliberalism is what they're talking about in the Seen on Radio, or globalization, whatever you want to call it. All these markets are so embedded now that, let's say you tried to do something like overthrow the government in America, and we decided we were not going to be distinctly capitalist and we were going to try to go for something completely different. Maybe we were finally going to have everything in common. Like, that just wouldn't last in a world where everyone else has a different set of rules for the game,
right?
Because they eventually will take advantage of you and your lack of desire to assert property rights and assert state rights and assert like physical force to protect those things from other people. You know what I mean? Like it kind of just doesn't work. And so in a sense, like capitalism has grown to a place where it's so hard to think of anything else that like Seen on Radio's best kind of alternatives is basically like, how do we work within these rules to like offset the negative aspects of it? And that's kind of like, I'd say more realistic, more progressive agendas, more politically liberal agendas. That's what they're really trying to do. They're employing like a Marxist critique, but they're rejecting the answer because they realize that's just so out there. Bernie Sanders is never going to get elected because what he's proposing is too radical. Yeah. But everyone agrees that there's a disparity and it needs to be addressed. You know what I mean? Those kind of things, I think, is what you see.
Okay.
Yeah. So commodification. Last thing I would say about commodification is that commodification is really bad in our modern times because of the digital life that we live. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you're on Facebook, you're on Instagram, you're doing your thing. In these scenarios, what's the product? You're not charged for being on these things. You just have to have an account.
Yeah.
So in this case, like, you are the product. Your attention is the product. It's no longer about a 9-to-5 job. It's about how much time can you basically spend staring at the content they're giving you. And so when you talk about commodifying something, they're literally commodifying your time, your life outside of a 9-to-5 job. And this is where I think you talk about like late stage capitalism, where it's like, what would it be like if I could, or what would it be like if I went to the government right now and I said, hey guys, you know, this whole like 40-hour work week, that's whack. Overtime, whack. You know, labor rights, whack. Let's just torch all of those. And hey man, if you don't want to work 80 plus hours a week, sorry about it. I'll find someone who can. That's life. I don't have to do anything. I'll terminate you for whatever reason I want. I'm not going to offer you benefits. Screw that, dude. No vacation. Like, I dictate the terms of this engagement because I'm the one giving the money out. So like everyone would riot. No one would be down for that. They'd be like, this is ridiculous. But let's say I created a product that you willfully spent your time doing after hours to an excess, that it started engaging with you just as you engaged with it. Like, I wouldn't need the law. I wouldn't need the state to intervene because now I've reached a point where I've got around the rules, where now I'm selling your attention. I'm creating a profile that you could argue I'm selling your lifestyle, and I don't have to pay you a thing. I don't have to worry about your insurance. I don't have to worry about any of that. You know what I mean? Like that's
wild.
But that's what happens. And that's what I think Marx tries to get at is like, this is a natural process in capitalism where anything that can be exploited will be exploited because it doesn't think of things in terms of right or wrong. It thinks of things in terms of margin. Can it make money? Can it be profitable? And so that's where I think you still see a lot of the value and a lot of the kind of persuasive elements of Marxism, because it's something that's really, really relevant to our lives even today in terms of when we stop and think about it, at least, aside from the quality of life we enjoy. Yeah. When we think about it, we're like, man, you know, we joke about not being able to retire. Like, that's a common joke now. You know what I mean? Yeah. Social Security is going to be shot by the time we get to retirement age. Like, we joke about these things because this is what we think is normal. You know what I mean? But I think Marx's thing would be like, that's because you have no class consciousness, dude. You don't have any awareness of the negative aspects of capitalism and how it's training you to think about what is normal and what is good and what is acceptable. Like, it's training your mind to dream like certain dreams. Like, I can't tell you how many times Hannah and I have just spitballed, like, we win the lottery, what are we going to do? You're right. And that's such a fun thing to think about because it's the stateless, stateless, jobless, property, you know what I mean? Like, when you have that much money, nothing is the same. You know what I mean? Right. Because money no longer becomes an object in your life. And so even in that way, it's like those kind of pipe dreams are all like they all fall within this world where capitalism sets the terms of the engagement. And so I think you still see a lot of it because of that. And that's the commodification of attention is a big one. I think the one you also see right now, the commodification of our bodies. So a more maybe spicy take, but, transgenderism coming to the kind of forefront of political dialogue. Well, there's like talks that, that Matt Walsh documentary of What is a Woman, obviously skewed, obviously biased, but there was a guy that was talking about how like every transgender person racks up a medical bill. So as a medical company, that's a demographic I haven't tapped. And that's the thought process that I think people don't want to think about, but those kind of conversations are guaranteed starting to happen because there's no right or wrong. It's basically just what makes money.
Yeah.
And there's no consequences, or there's not as much thought about the consequences. Why is it so hard for people to have a meaningful conversation about the effects of the environment? You know what I mean? Like seen on radio when it starts talking about that, I'm like, oh gosh, here we go. Here's another hippie. Yeah. But like, why do I think that? And why is it so hard to talk about? It's because capitalism doesn't consider long-term consequences. It considers immediate gain. It considers profit. If there was a way to make stay-at-home moms profitable, everyone would do it. Yeah. But because it doesn't produce a measurable value for the economy, it's not considered a real job. You know what I mean? Like that's what capitalism does. You know what I mean? It starts to tell you what's good and bad. And and when you start buying into it, then for a lot of people who might not be Christian, who don't have another morality or worldview to kind of cement themselves in, it can be very like persuasive. You know what I mean? So talking about commodification, I have on here commodity fetishism, which is a really, really interesting concept in Marxist thought, but I don't know if we have time to like really dig into it. But I would say one other thing that he talks a lot about is alienation. And you still see this language, the language of alienation in modern discourse. And it's huge. I think that's one of the things that keeps Marxism relevant in critical social theory. Marx basically said, because you're a productive person and because you exist in an economy or a political economy like capitalism that essentially tells you have to work or you will die.
Yeah.
Your labor is forced. It's not freely creative. And so you become alienated from yourself because you're no longer truly doing what you essentially do as a person, which is freely create. Now you're forced to create.
Yeah.
And everything you create resembles this state of alienation. And so everything you're surrounded with in your world reminds you of the way in which you don't have control of any of those things and you're alienated from it. And then because you experience this, you look around at everyone else and you realize that just like you don't understand your own self, in a sense, like you're alienated from yourself, you're alienated from other people, either because they're in the same situation as you and remind you of your own alienation, or because they hold a means of distribution, means of production, kind of a higher level in the bourgeoisie, and you're alienated from them because you just can't relate to that life. Like this idea of alienation speaks more to like the psychological understanding of ourselves. It's become really popular in the modern times, but it was probably really, really powerful during the Industrial Revolution because people's lives were so monotonous. You know what I mean? You had such little power. Since then, you have labor rights. You have, mandatory holidays. You have, 40-hour work weeks, overtime, child labor laws. I don't know if I said that, but like the things have changed since then so that there's a little less of that immediate confrontation with this feeling like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
If you're sitting there and your job is to put a screw in a door on an assembly line and you do that 100,000 times a week and someone asks you, hey man, what's your legacy? Like, that's a crushing question. You know what I mean? Like, bro, it's like the Rick and Morty thing that everyone talks about, where he makes that little robot and its only job is to pass the butter, and it's like sentient, and he's like, what's my job? He's like, dude, your job is to pass the butter. And it's just like super sad, like that's kind of like a word picture of like what it's like, is some people, it's like, that's their experience of work, is they go to work, they struggle through their job. They don't know why they do it. They know it's necessary, but when they really stop and think about why it's necessary, it doesn't immediately make sense. Like why should I have to go to work and do this? You know what I mean? Like, it's just how it is. That's just what it means to live in the world. I know. Those are the kind of things I think really speak to this idea of alienation. And that's a huge concept in Marxist thought. Actually comes from his buddy Hegel, dude he took a lot of stuff from, but that gets really in the weeds philosophically, so it's probably not worth going over. But yeah, those kind of things, big ideas in Marxist thought, and that's pretty much all I have on Marx. I was going to do a little teaser on critical social theory, but
that was a ride, man.
I know, dude. It's a lot. It
is a lot.
And I guess it's hard because I want to explain this in a way that equips people to understand the deeper thoughts behind it, because then it's easier to understand when it's at work. Like when you're in these conversations and someone says something like that, you can understand where that came from, and then you can decide for yourself, like, do I agree or not? Or is the way that they're saying that maybe, like, if I were to agree to that, especially as a Christian, like, if I were to agree to that, does that mean that I'm assenting to a view that kind of holds material world, materialism as like the preeminent existence? You know what I mean? Like, what does faith have to say about these kind of things? You know, like, there's a lot of cool stuff like that to think through. And I don't know, there's a lot.
Yeah, that is a lot
to talk about.
Yeah. So
recap, Marxism is crazy. Capitalism might be crazier. Might be. So I guess what I'd ask you, I've been talking for like a straight hour.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts if I convinced you to become a Marxist?
No, not at all. Because I can't just ditch. Now Marxists might call me, I don't know, ignorant or something. But how do you get that word if you don't have any morals? No, I think.
Yeah.
No, I can't just throw away my morals, because I'm very deeply rooted in this idea of goodness and badness and my relation to both, like, and how my tendency towards badness, and I have a clear definition of badness, which is any deviation from like what God has willed for me, and like the will of me living into the will of God is me getting to experience the fullness of the goodness and glory of God. And so no, you haven't convinced me to become a Marxist, but I think for me, it hinges more on this idea that like, no, I do think that there's morality, and I don't think it's necessarily tied to capitalism, because oppression and suffering was happening to Israel like well before capitalism was ever a thing, right? And there was still this like longing for, or this idea, this promise that was coming, that like freedom would be attainable. Like freedom in God would be attainable to Israel, and then they would be able to bless, like the nations would be blessed through this promise that God was going to give Israel. And so, maybe if you guys want to say like the Bible's just been manipulated to fit this capitalist narrative, so we in capitalism could sit there and look like, see, even like this has always been, like oppression has always happened, and like, having faith and displaying righteousness because of your faith in the supreme being is what carries us through, because there is something promised on the other side. I don't know. This to a true Marxist or anyone that really abides by critical social theory or critical race theory might just think that I'm just sort of like this ignorant, ridiculous, like too far gone person. And to that, I would say maybe, but I don't think so.
Well, and I think like what I would also want to say is that like capitalism isn't like a forever thing. So like there's times before capitalism, right? And Marx will talk about, excuse me, we'll talk about the change of society and how we have changed our relationship to the material world through feudalism and then into capitalism. But what he's trying to do is depict capitalism as like a very insidious thing, because it's not that like slavery didn't happen before, right? Or oppression didn't happen before, but it's almost like he wants to say that capitalism is like, it's like giving you the poison, but trying to tell you like, this is good for you. You know what I mean? That's like you're
just like the petroleum based food dyes.
Yeah, dude. The lead based paint, dude. I mean, this is maybe something I disregarded earlier, is that, Marx is very concerned with social relations, but he just sees that through material conditions. He sees that through the economy. So, you talk about like the how capitalism wants to present itself in a certain way. And for Marx, he's trying to say, well, we've always had these social relations tied up in the way we relate to the world. But the problem with capitalism is it like takes those relations and it starts to obscure them in a really weird way, where there's no longer a one-to-one understanding, where like previously when I was a serf, or, I had like a feudal lord, I knew I didn't own my land. I knew I had to give him a certain percentage of my crop or whatever. Like, that relationship wasn't hidden. It was very explicit. It was tied into the way in which I related to the physical world. But I think what he wants to say is, in capitalism, all of that is pushed out into abstraction and it's hidden. And so for the everyday person, they don't see it. And that's part of the insidious nature of it, is like this strain on society, on social relations, which capitalism wants to tell you is good. Like, it's good to go be a worker bee and all this stuff. And he's trying to say like, no, that's like it's doing its thing. You know what I mean? It's having its way with you. And really it's just hiding what is essentially slavery. And so that's kind of where his arguments start to go. So that's a pretty big call out, I would say, is like, it's not like he would say there's never been other oppressed people, but I think he has a special like asterisk on capitalist oppression, because he's like, it's kind of like low key, like hidden, you know what I mean? And for that reason, it's very effective. Last thoughts, man. Is there anything else I'd say? There's so much to talk about when it comes to this topic, and that I think we got the most of it. I think we got the core elements. Like, if I listen back to this, I'm probably going to be like, oh, you butchered that. But I think we got the core elements of Marxism such that you could go and read something like the Communist Manifesto, and you'd have a pretty good idea of what it's talking about in terms of the principles. And then you could see kind of internal dialogues in the country and hear these words like emancipation or liberation or freedom or equality or equity. And you can be a little bit more poised to understand where they might be coming from, because some people are just adopting the language, not really defining it.
Yeah, they don't necessarily comprehend the nuance behind.
Yeah. But I think one thing that's true is that in the academic circles, Marxism is alive and well. It's never been probably in a better spot in terms of its impact on history. Like I mentioned in the notes, like the historiography, so how history is studied or how it's presented. Marx's interpretation of history is like probably the prevailing way of understanding it. So yeah, I hope that this podcast episode, although it was really talky, was really philosophical.
Very wordy.
Yes, so wordy.
With a lowercase w.
Yeah. Which is also, like, I would say this is my closing thought, because I'll keep rambling about this stuff. Ironically, Marx actually did a really good job at describing the way in which idolatry works according to the Bible. So he has this idea. I wasn't going to bring this up. No,
Let's do it.
So he has this idea called commodity fetishism. And he uses the word fetish in a different way than most people think. Most people think like sexual, right? But he's pulling this from another writer who wrote, Feuerbach. He wrote The Essence of Christianity. He was dogging on it, saying it was all just like a pipe dream. But what he describes, Feuerbach and Marx, what they describe is that this way that idolatry works, where it, for instance, is like an image, like a thing, according to the Bible, right? It's like a thing that you put value in and you worship. And according to the psalmist, it's like they have eyes, but they can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear. All those people who make them become like them. And that's kind of the idea that Marx wants to say happens within a capitalist system. These commodities we create, they start to have this life that's not in and of themselves. Like it doesn't belong to them, just like capitalism. It doesn't belong to itself. It's a product of our giving our will and our power, our life to it. And then it comes and it turns back on us and it rules over us. And in this way, it kind of creates little capitalists. Like we become these weird disembodied people or alienated people because we're being controlled by something that we technically control. So that is, in a really weird way, him describing how idolatry works. It's like you place your faith and your life into something that can never give it back to you.
Yeah.
But somehow it rules over you and it demands your affections and your attentions. And in so doing, it kind of ruins your life in a sense. Like it ruins your whatever. Like that kind of thing is the same thing that Marx describes at scale with capitalism. And he talks about it specifically in regards to commodity fetishism, but he takes that same argument from his buddy that this is what Christianity does. This is his critique of Christianity, is that Christianity, although it talks about idolatry, is itself idolatry.
Yeah.
He says that it, like religion itself, is a projection that we keep alive that works back on us. And because it's not real and it's dependent on us for its very existence, it creates alienated people. And so it reinforces this alienation. So I thought that was always interesting when I read his work, and I was like, man, Marx specifically talks a lot about alienation in the Alienated Labor, which is an article he wrote as part of the French manuscripts that are published, the ones that are a little bit more philosophical. And I was always shocked and really and kind of encouraged to a certain extent, because the way I view that is like there is a truth that he's getting at, reality that he's getting at. And I guess to really land the plane, what I would say the goal of Marxist thought was revolution. In fact, he says, and I think it's like he wrote, was it 10, maybe 11 theses on Feuerbach? He's the guy I was just talking about, the essence of Christianity. He talks about how philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the purpose of philosophy is to change it. And so he considered himself not a traditional philosopher, even though he was highly philosophical. But I think when you consider that idea in the context of the whole conversation, I think that's a lot of what critical social theory tries to do. It's what Marx is trying to do. He's interpreting the world, but for the purposes of changing it. And I would argue, as some other people have started to argue, that the OG of that is Christianity. You know what I mean? Like it is the OG critical social theory. It is the most legitimate because it accounts for the metaphysical reality and the physical reality. And it's doing that in a way that's trying to say, like, the point isn't just to have this mental assent to propositions that are true, but to change it, to change you as a person and to change the world. You know what I mean? So that's where I would leave. That's my last.
Was a really good way to tie it in.
Yeah, dude.
I like it.
I don't know if that even makes sense.
I liked it a lot.
I'm going to run with it.
Dude, I liked that a lot. So what you're saying is Jesus is better than Feuerbach and Marx.
Yeah, dude.
And Adam Smith. And sweet. I can get on board with that.
Yeah, and we should do another episode that talks about more of like the historical development of liberalism and capitalism.
Sure.
Liberalism with like a capital L, where it's like the foundations of democratic theory.
Yeah.
But
that sounds like, let's do some like lighthearted fun stuff before we
yeah, I know, right? You're like, I don't know why we just dropped a bunch of viewership. This is fun for you and I,
but this is going to probably like rattle some cages and shake some chains and stuff.
I know.
Which isn't a bad thing. I mean, I hope that honestly, like, this is not something that I have really ever had to wrestle with. And so having a friend like you that has read so deeply into these things to sort of illuminate these ideas and these philosophies that are out there to me. And like, I have to, you know, there's going to be contest within me that is like, well, do I believe what I say I believe? And how does this change? Because honestly, you can't hear something if you're actually like letting it, if you're actually ruminating on something, it will change you.
Yeah.
And not necessarily to say that it like causes you to morph your ideas of your worldview, but like maybe it works to like help solidify them even more, but maybe it does make you realize like, oh, one of my shortcomings is that I didn't take this into account. So now how do I essentially use my worldview? And in our regard, it's like, how do we utilize our faith in God to account for that ideal or philosophy or whatever? And how am I going to, because there may be a time where like, no, I don't have to be able, like, I don't have to agree with that, but I might encounter someone like that's their worldview. And how do I, if I'm effectively trying to be used by the Holy Spirit to have God win over other people and like to change their hearts, then how will I interact in that way? And so
I also think like there's an element of it that's like, even if you don't agree with anything that we talked about, like you at least know that people walk around with that idea, and that, you know, if you don't agree, that's one thing, but also just knowing that there are kind of currents around that are trying to, that maybe not trying to, but just have a natural pressure that they exert on us. And so in the middle of just trying to walk a faithful life, it's good to know of these ideas and to just be able to say like, okay, in this particular thing, you know, maybe it's like a particular aspect of Marxism we talked about. You're like, yeah, I don't agree with that. But then if like for you live as though the spiritual world doesn't exist as a Christian, like that's not legit. You know what I mean? Like it helps expose those inconsistencies in our own faith maybe. And I think it helps us shore those things up.
Yeah,
also,
for sure.
Like you were saying, kind of like strengthens your faith in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And so all of that, for me, all of that was just to say like, maybe this is super heavy for you, or like causes you to, maybe this wasn't super interesting for you at all, but honestly, like I'm going to be thinking about this for a while now. And,
if you're listening this far, you deserve an award.
Just know.
You're an honorary Marxist now.
You have now become an overthinker.
Yeah. This is honestly what I think too much about, because
dude, you're not the only one though. I mean, I don't necessarily think about this, but I have patients that are just like, what do you do for fun? I mean, I've had a patient that basically is like, how do you not go home and just like wish for death? And I'm like, I know, right? And it's like,
you're like, I'm the one walking right now, bro.
You know,
like,
I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, there's this perception from some people when I talk to them about things that they're like, who has time to do this much thinking? And I'm like, I don't just sit at home and just like ponder like for hours and just like go off into a different world. And then Desiree's like, hey, will you help me with our daughter? Yeah. No, dude, these are like thoughts that happen in passing. And then I'm like, the next time this gets brought up, I need to remember to bring up that thought I had, so that way I can flesh it out a little better. Yeah. And it's honestly the only way that I really think and solidify ideas in my head is by talking with someone about these things. And then I'm like, ooh, this is where my thinking happens.
Yeah. Same here for the most part. I mean, I kind of do a little bit of both. You know what I mean? Like I'm sitting there with a book and.
Well, sure. I mean, if you're reading something that makes sense, but I'm not just like, you're not just like sitting while your kids are like chaotically screaming, playing video games, and your wife is like trying to keep the house in order and stuff. And you're just like, you know what I mean?
I wonder about that.
Thoughts happen very quickly. Like our minds work very fast. And so we do have full-time jobs. We take care of our families.
Yep. Because we live in a capitalism. There we go. Got it full circle.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Like we said, let us know what you think. Yeah, if this topic was super interesting to you and you have other things you want us to discuss in regards in this realm or any of our episodes, please feel free to find a way to get a hold of us, and we'll try to flesh some more stuff out and see what else we can overthink. Yep. And if this was too convoluted, let us know. Let us give us some feedback, because this is the kind of stuff where, like Austin was saying, it's fun for us to talk about, but if it's not like helpful or whatever, we can pivot. So yeah, for sure. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. You guys have a good day. See ya.